Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavors of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh coming to you from Auckland, and it's a pleasure to welcome back to the show Ilka and Mary. How are you both? How are you going there, Mary?
Doing well. We're in the last days, I think, of our warmer weather. Thankfully, we have a little rain forecast for next week. Super excited about that.
Yeah, we've had no shortage of that here in Auckland recently as we're heading into spring. And Ilka, how are things going for you?
They're pretty good here in Philadelphia, but I'm actually getting ready to go to New York tomorrow to go to the FIA's Passive House conference, and I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, which I think by the time this comes out will be completed, and we'll be doing a bit of a wrap up of that. I know that Zach isn't with us today because he's en route to that conference and very excited to be there, especially off the back of our guest interview last week on the show, which was great to get Katrine on the Passive House podcast. Now, we've got another great guest this week, but before we get into that, Mary, you want to give us a bit of a shout out to the supporters of the Passive House Accelerator?
The supporters that we love to thank of the Passive House Accelerator, the founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minotaur All-in-One HVAC, Mitsubishi Electric Heating and Air Conditioning, Partel, RDH Building Science, Rockwool, Stowe, and Zola. And our champion sponsors are ACORN Windows and SIGA, and our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA.
Awesome. Thank you to all those great sponsors, and thank you to our lovely listeners. And don't forget that we always love to hear from you, and also get a rating or review. So you can head on over to Apple or wherever you download your podcast. Give us a rating, give us a review, and share this podcast with others. All right. Well, this week, Ilana Judah, she's a resilience and sustainability leader. Is there anything else either of you want to tell us about her before we jump into your interview?
Well, I think she's described herself pretty well in the podcast. All the work that she's been doing, looking at resilience and mitigation measures together, and that's the work she's been doing.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it, and we'll chat on the other side.
Welcome, Ilana Judah, principal and founder of ACORN Resilience and Sustainability. It's great to talk with you today.
Thank you, Mary. Nice to be here.
So before you founded ACORN, you were principal and director of sustainability at FX Collaborative in New York City. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what you did there?
Absolutely. So I was FX Collaborative's first director of sustainability. I joined the firm back in 2008 when it was called FX FAL. And as the first director of sustainability, I was really responsible for so many different things. First of all, sort of developing organizational wide approaches for the firm, positioning the firm with respect to sustainability. So this included things like developing and implementing the overall firm-wide sustainability strategic plan, leading the office's green team, putting into place office-wide systems such as green specifications, contract language, material selection criteria, project benchmarking for energy and carbon through the AIA 2030 commitment, project reviews for sustainability, environmental analysis, education and training, all that kind of stuff. And then that was within the organization. And then I also, of course, focused a lot on projects. So integrating sustainability strategies into all projects, carrying out workshops, working with clients, and also managing and directing certifications and other types of analyses and reports. And then the third leg of that stool was really external. So, of course, first of all, that involved things such as bringing in business related to sustainability, going on project interviews and sort of winning work or helping to win work, specifically for a sustainability focused project or a component of a project. And then a lot of work in the green building community. So voluntary task forces and committees for the city, as well as for the American Institute of Architects and New York Passive House, and, associated speaking engagements. So really a very comprehensive role.
Yes, that sounds very comprehensive. So what inspired, given that you were in such a leadership position there, what inspired you to leave that firm and go back to school?
I was there for 10 years, and I was, of course, had a huge opportunity to do so many things. And what I was noticing was that where I was having the greatest leverage was actually on those policy task forces and committees. And that really, I would go to a meeting and we'd be discussing, things such as implementing Passive House or requiring a certain Passive House criteria and legislation. And eventually you started seeing that translated into actual policy. So that was a motivator for me, in the sense that I felt like I might have more leverage beyond the walls of an architecture firm. And I really, really loved working at FX Collaborative. So it wasn't specific to that particular firm, but just in general, I saw the opportunity for more leverage. I also wanted to get a broader understanding of sustainability and more formal training. Of course, I was trained as an architect and had worked in my career as an architect and was brought up in a very sustainability focused family, and sort of got into green building through sort of my values, but I never really had any formal training on climate or environment, and it was sort of learned on the job. So that was also a motivator. And I felt it was a good time to take a sabbatical to reflect on all I had done in my time in New York, and really, given the sort of critical nature of the climate crisis, figure out how I could have most leverage. And I thought that going back to school, expanding my knowledge in sustainability and climate, and especially climate adaptation and resilience, which is becoming more and more of an issue, would be a terrific opportunity to kind of both reflect and learn.
Sounds really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about specifically the program that you joined at UBC?
Sure. So I was looking around for different programs and came across this program, which is the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. It's always among the top 10 sustainability programs, on those top 10 lists in the world, up there with Cambridge and others. And what I really liked about it was, well, first of all, my main reason for going there was because of the professor who I eventually worked with, who is my supervisor, Dr. Stephanie Chang. And Dr. Chang has worked her whole academic career on disaster resilience, starting out first with earthquakes, but then now has expanded into other climate-related issues as well. So I wanted to work with her, but also the program is interdisciplinary, which means that it has there are certain core courses which are really about framing climate issues that everybody takes, both master's and PhD students. But then you have the opportunity to work on your own research with your supervisor and to craft really a very bespoke research problem, and also interact with students working on all kinds of environmental issues ranging from energy, air pollution, water resource management, indigenous knowledge, sustainable agriculture, to name a few. There are other topics as well. And so I like that as a mid-career person, that I was able to, first of all, design my studies, and focus on what I wanted to. And of course, more generally, I really love the Pacific Northwest, and I thought it would be a very inspiring place to focus on these topics, given just the beauty of the natural environment here.
Yes, we should have mentioned that UBC is the University of British Columbia, indeed a beautiful place. And there's such great fertility in exchanging ideas with people across different disciplines. So your work there, you eventually developed your master's thesis. Can you tell us about the topic of that and how did you develop that?
Sure. So my master's thesis focused on this concept of adaptive mitigation, which really stems from this idea that climate mitigation, or the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and sort of green building as we know it, and adaptation and resilience. And there are many ways to define resilience, but sort of generally speaking, should be treated together as an integrated approach. We, traditionally, in many instances, certainly in the built environment, they've often been siloed traditionally, and there's really such a need to look at the problem, especially with the sort of latest IPCC report that just came out, that we are unfortunately going to have to adapt. And of course, the greatest way to adapt is, of course, to reduce emissions, but that we are already facing consequences. So we're going to have to do both. So I chose that as sort of a thematic issue. And then more specifically with respect to the built environment, I was very interested in the relationship of neighborhoods and buildings and how that all plays out with respect to adaptation and resilience. So the kind of interlinking of the building scale and the community scale. And also I wanted to bring in, of course, my background and experience in architecture, sustainability, and green building. So what ended up happening is that my professor sent me a potential grant that involved partnering with what we would call a solution seeker. So basically a nonprofit, a for-profit company, a government agency, any non-academic entity essentially that was looking for research help in developing a solution. And somebody connected me with the BC Housing Authority and their research group. And they had an initiative, or they have an initiative rather, called MBAR, Mobilizing Building Adaptation and Resilience. And so they were actually very interested, in this Mobilizing Building Adaptation and Resilience initiative. They were looking for ways to help better integrate adaptation and resilience into their protocols. And so, and they have already existing standards with respect to mitigation and sustainability and energy. So I partnered with them. We applied for the grant. We won the grant from the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And I essentially developed this adaptive mitigation approach, or this framework approach for them to help them implement or integrate adaptation and resilience into their their process. And so the outcome of my research is called the Integrated Building Adaptation and Mitigation Assessment Framework, otherwise known as IBAMA.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how you kind of took all your background, education and experience, and kind of turned that together with all these opportunities that you had at UBC into something that then you could use, in the future in your own practice. Can you tell us a little bit more specific what the IBAMA framework is?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, IBAMA stands for the Integrated Building Adaptation and Mitigation Assessment. And what it is it's really a methodology and a set of tools that I've developed to help building industry stakeholders, so those could be owners, developers, clients, and also designers, to kind of establish what their, first of all, their initial risks are with respect to climate hazards and climate risks and what we call vulnerabilities. So, of course, different locations and communities have different risks and vulnerabilities, and of course, are exposed to different hazards. And to help those communities and those projects develop an understanding of what those potential risks would be through the lifespan of their project. So not only in the sort of current or present time, but also thinking about what future climate projections will be over the lifespan of their project. So let's say the next 60 or 70 years of their building's life. And then developing an understanding of their context or the neighborhood of their project and how resilient their neighborhood is to those risks and what assets they might have. And then based on that, helping them establish specific measurable adaptation goals, and really sort of trying to hone in on what those targets might be, because we talk a lot about adaptation strategies. We're going to put flood protection in there. We're going to put, air conditioning in to deal with heat risk, but we don't always set very clear criteria, or at least we don't always communicate clearly what those criteria are. So helping establish what those goals are, and then determining appropriate strategies and establishing sort of how those strategies can be evaluated. So that sort of part is the adaptation part, but in parallel, there's the mitigation and sustainability part. So how do the mitigation and sustainability goals, so let's say we're targeting passive house, interact with those adaptation goals? So if you're pursuing passive house and you have let's say extreme heat risk or wildfire risk, how do passive house goals and strategies interact with those adaptation and resilience goals for those specific hazards? And where can we find synergies between those strategies, and where could there be conflicts and unintended consequences? So that's really what the basis of IBAMA is about. And it's really a sort of step-by-step approach that asks questions to project teams to help them hone in on those goals and strategies and determine the most synergistic solutions.
That's so interesting, because in a way it's a little bit like when PHPP first or WUFI first became used more widely by architects. Many architects responded by saying, oh, this is so helpful because it gives me a really concrete way to figure out, well, if I change the number of windows on this facade, how is it going to affect the energy balance in my building? And this just takes that a big step further to look at, to help integrate all sorts of factors, risk factors, design factors, neighborhood factors. That's great. And has the this framework been piloted in any design situation so far?
Yes. So I finished my studies in December of 2020 and have been consulting with BC Housing and helping them pilot the framework. So we completed this summer the first pilot on a project called Vienna House, which is in early design stages. And it's a project in East Vancouver, a housing project. And so we held a series of workshops to test the IBAMA framework. And during COVID, they were online workshops. And with both, what was great about it is it was the design team, the ownership team, which is a multifaceted ownership team, as they often are. And also we had some participation from some members of the City of Vancouver and some researchers that are also connected with the Vienna House project. So we did finish the first pilot. I'm just completing a report with recommendations to BC Housing, because of course the framework will evolve and change as it gets piloted and tested. So I made some recommendations on moving forward, and BC Housing is going to be undertaking several pilots over the next year of the framework on different types of projects.
That's great. Going back to certifications, now you mentioned that sometimes you look at the Passive House certification standards and see where it helps or maybe be a conflict with your broader goals. Where do you see the value of certifications in general, and where do you see disadvantages? And what other certification usually go well with your framework?
Sure. So IBAMA isn't really, it's certification agnostic. So it's, as I mentioned, it's sort of it's a process-based tool. So it's sort of a question asking tool. When I developed it, and this is it's an interesting question of why is it not structured to be a certification tool? So when I was doing my academic work, I drew from I reviewed lots and lots of green building frameworks. Specifically, many of them were on the, of course, the sustainability side. And then there's some other frameworks that looked at resilience and such. And then some that were more kind of moving towards regenerative approaches. So I drew from many resources that were frameworks. And in the IBAMA reference guide, I also refer to many frameworks, particularly with respect to setting goals and strategies. So I do draw from LEAD, and I reference LEAD, I reference Passive House, I reference RELY, I reference WELL, other resources, other frameworks, the READY framework for earthquakes that was developed by Arup. So I drew from many resources. But it's not centered around certification. And the reason being is that BC Housing wanted to have a very flexible approach to setting goals and strategies. When it comes to adaptation, risks, vulnerabilities and risks can be so localized and context specific. And so it's really hard to say you're going to get so many points. Generalizing, it could be done, but generalizing, you're going to get so many points for this, and it might be so much more critical to do something in one region than another region. So I felt like for this stage and for master's work that it would be most important to map out the process, and then maybe eventually, those types of details could be worked out over time about whether it would be helpful to certify. But I think one of the challenges in certifying is that you don't want to have a maladaptive situation where someone's going for points because it's easy to do something, but it doesn't really either help the project or it might have some unintended consequences. So I'm not against certification. I think certification can be extremely valuable. It's a common language. and sets basic standards. But for the case of IBAMA, I just felt it wasn't the appropriate approach.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like sometimes certifications are just not adaptive enough, right? That's your goal, to really make it fit and get the best possible outcome for each project. And certifications are sometimes a little too rigid that way.
They certainly can be. And I think, again, if I had taken the time to do a PhD, maybe I would have been able to, figure out a system perhaps for British Columbia that could be a certification system. If I were able to look into the specifics of the issues, but I was a little bit concerned about sort of not some of those unintended consequences, perhaps.
So your time as a student is over, but you've started a new chapter of your life by founding ACORN Resilience and Sustainability. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing with that?
Sure. And, ACORN came out of, I hadn't intended to start a business. I was going to, finish my studies, go back to New York and, bring my learnings with me and try to sort of leverage, have more leverage, as I mentioned earlier, in order to kind of help advance issues with respect to this urgent crisis. But partly for a couple of reasons, partly because of the pandemic, and also because I had work that ended up emerging from, what I had done in academia. I didn't feel ready to go back to New York in the middle of the pandemic. And I did have requests for work and contracts. So I formalized a small company, ACORN Resilience and Sustainability, and, have sort of been helping a few clients, both on the mitigation and sustainability side and the adaptation side. So I mentioned sort of the BC Housing Vienna House pilot, sort of spin-off work from the development of IBAMA. And also another major client has been the Pembina Institute, where I've been helping them roll out their reframed retrofit initiative, which has both sort of the carbon reduction objectives, but also adaptation and resilience objectives, as well as health and well-being objectives as part of their initiative.
And can you tell us a little bit more about that Pembina retrofit lab that you were working on?
Absolutely. So the reframed initiative and this particular lab is an initiative to retrofit 6 buildings in British Columbia in different regions of the province, multi-unit residential buildings, or MURBs, that are sort of a typical representative buildings of existing, in this case, affordable housing projects. They're 3-4 story apartment buildings, rentals, and some of them date back to the 1960s, 1970s. And the idea here is to use these 6 buildings as demonstration projects for retrofit innovation and as replicable models to really scale up retrofits across the province. And there are multifaceted objectives to this initiative. One of them, of course, is related to deep carbon emissions reduction. And that doesn't just include operational carbon, it also includes embodied carbon. Others are related to seismic and climate resilience. And others focus on issues such as health and well-being, because many of these buildings house vulnerable populations. And of course, there are objectives related to economics and finance and costs, and how can we optimize solutions to, basically scale up in such a way that these can be affordable solutions. And so I worked on developing the the request for proposal, and for this first phase, which is called the reframed labs, where basically project teams were selected. They're each assigned a building, and they will be working over about a 6-month period to develop solutions. It's essentially up to a schematic design level, but they'll be gathering together over this period for collective workshops, even though they're each focusing on their own project. They'll be coming together for a series of workshops to share ideas, to focus on specific themes. So for example, there'll be a specific workshop that will be focused on embodied carbon, for example, and exercises related to that. There'll be one workshop that focuses on climate and seismic adaptation and understanding how to undertake those sort of assessments to look at future climate and seismic risk. And so the idea here is it's kind of a competitive collaboration in a way and so there's an idea, of course, if you've got 6 teams, that you're helping to build that initial capacity to be thinking in this more integrated manner when doing retrofits.
Well, I can see how that fits with your integrated framework, and that's exciting because I'm sure these 6 buildings, as you said, they're typical of BC affordable housing, but they're probably also typical of residential buildings that aren't necessarily affordable housing, right?
Yes, definitely in BC. I mean, the typology here, it's very different than New York City, at least, in that they're low rise, fairly low rise, 4 stories is sort of the maximum, but they're certainly condo buildings or co-op buildings that in BC that would have a similar typology, and I would imagine in other parts of the region beyond BC as well.
So I'm curious about like how all the participants end up working together. Is it hard for them to all of a sudden work in such a collaborative and integrated environment? Because I'm sure a lot of them haven't done it this way before. Is there resistance, or is everyone happy to be part of this broader goal?
Well, the workshops haven't started yet, so I think right now they're in the process of awarding the contracts to the 6 teams. But the RFP is very, very clear on the sort of scope of what the process is, and I think many are actually excited by this opportunity, because I don't think when you're typically doing a multifamily retrofit, it's pretty straightforward. There isn't necessarily a budget for the sort of integrated design approach and opportunity for that much innovation. These are fairly modest buildings, and so I would imagine people are excited. I mean, I do want to point out that they all have their own buildings, so nobody is directly competing on the same project. They're all developing their own work, and they've already been selected. So it's not like it's a competition per se. It's just that they will be sharing ideas. It's also very clearly structured. So these workshops are, half-day workshops. They come together, and then, several weeks pass, they do their work, they come back, they share their work, and there are structured exercises. So, it's been designed in such a way that they can still progress on their own projects, and they're not necessarily working on somebody else's project, but they're really just coming together to share.
That's great, and hopefully they'll be stimulating manufacturers' responses to the needs that they can identify in these retrofits.
Yes, I think, Pembina has been very focused on reaching out to manufacturers, kind of collecting sort of a library of potential solutions and connecting manufacturers to design teams. So that's definitely part of the initiative. It was that component wasn't as much part of my scope, but there's somebody else at Pembina that's been working on that. And so that's been it's really been a fun project for me to to help with as part of my consulting at ACORN. And so, I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen with those workshops. But I am sort of winding down my consulting work here in BC because my partner and I now feel like it's time for us to go back to New York. So I started to look for opportunities back in New York and see where I can take IBAMA and my learnings back to the East Coast.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, so part of your reason to go back to school was to think about and learn about the biggest levers that as an architect that you can pull, or as a member of the AEC community that you can pull to deal with this climate crisis. What kind of position are you looking for at this point?
I'm looking for a leadership type of position. I've been speaking to a lot of people in government. I've also been speaking with some nonprofit or industry type of associations that have broader, sort of a broader reach. And so kind of using my background in the built environment, because of course the built environment plays a huge role, as we all know, in both mitigation and adaptation. And so I feel like I bring a fair amount of technical background, and that can be helpful to some of the sort of broader policy-based organizations to bring that expertise to the table. And so I'm talking to those folks. I'm also talking to several large engineering firms, because I think one of the challenges in working in an architecture firm with respect to some of these climate issues is that there, especially on the adaptation and resilience side, is that you need to have such a diversity of expertise when you're working on these issues. You might need to work with meteorologists and climate scientists, structural engineers, and energy engineers, and landscape architects. And so trying to bring together sort of in this integrated way these different experts is also an objective of mine. And so that's why I'm also looking at some of the larger engineering firms.
And there's a whole nother perspective that you are interested in as well, right? So I've watched some of your very amazing recordings about IBAMA. And every time you start talking about your framework, you actually emphasize that you are presenting the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the First Nations people. Can you expand on this, and how, and does it influence your perspective and the approach to your work?
Well, this is something I am very I'm very new to. When I arrived in British Columbia, we call this a land acknowledgement, and every presentation I went to, every sort of class, almost every class that lecture or anything at school started with a land acknowledgement here. And I grew up in Canada, but I grew up on the East Coast, and I think most people of my generation never learned a thing about First Nations and colonization and so forth. And that was it's really sort of standard to do things like that here. So I've started to learn a little bit about it. I wouldn't say I know very much, but the fact that we, I think the thing that's been most meaningful to me is to understand this principle that we are guests on this land. And, the land is unceded. Most of it is unceded, and it doesn't belong to me. It doesn't, of course, people, own property and real estate and so forth, but this principle that the land does not belong to us. The land, we are guests. And I think that lens, when thinking about whether it be, any sort of environmental protection, adaptation, mitigation is this mindset that we are guests and that it belongs to somebody else and we should treat the land accordingly. And I think that I've started to read some of the thinking around what's called traditional ecological knowledge, which kind of goes along the lines of those principles of things like just taking what you need, not taking more, being respectful of the land, listening to the land. And there's a wonderful book I just finished recently called Braiding Sweetgrass by a writer named Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's I think she's American, but she's Native American or First Nations. That talks a lot about this sort of mindset of learning from the land. And so again, I'm not an expert, but I'm just trying to assimilate some of that thinking or absorb some of that thinking. And I'm not sure where that's going to take me, but I think it's all something that we can all benefit from.
Yeah, that was a great book. She's a really good writer. And when in my moments when I get sort of more concerned / depressed about where we're headed, it's actually a good perspective to have that this land doesn't belong to us and maybe humans aren't going to fare so well going forward, but the earth will survive and move on. Not the most cheerful ways to leave this podcast, but I really want to thank you, Ilana, for the work that you're doing to hopefully get us to a point where the planet will continue to be habitable and more comfortable for all of us, and that individual buildings can also be places of refuge during climate events. So,
well, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and Mary, I think that I think we can be feeling this climate crisis and the both tragedy and urgency of it, but also I think that's one of the things that I loved about that book is that there are these in the small things, there are some bits of light. There's some cracks of light, and things that people are doing. And so I think that we have to keep looking for those bits of light and those wonderful stories of things that people are working towards, and hopefully gaining some momentum from those to inspire us to move forward.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what the accelerator does best.
But maybe also, I think it's also inspiring or to, there's a lot of hope in the knowledge that you can draw from knowledge that was there before we came up with all this technology, right? That there's something that we can draw from and see, positive outcomes.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think, part of that is about how to collaborate, how to work together better, how to communicate better, how to listen better. I think that, traditional ecological knowledge, really, some of those principles of taking time to really think things through and understand things, listen to and look at our place. If we can find ways to do that better, I think that would be a great start.
Well, thanks so much for your time and for all the work that you do. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
My
so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you both.
All right. And that was Ilana Judah, who is now the founder of ACORN Resilience and Sustainability. But still, is she still studying, or is that her main thing now is only working as a consultant with the aim of moving back to the East Coast?
She's done with her master's program and not a student any longer, and is working as a consultant on a couple of exciting projects there. Reframed initiative.
Well, let's start start out with you, Mary. What were your main outtakes from that chat?
Well, just the whole framework with which that she developed that brings together mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency in an integrated approach, I think is extremely thoughtful. And in these days, as climate change, we're starting to feel the impacts everywhere. More so, resiliency obviously has become a bigger deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are different, aren't they? Resilience, adaptation, and mitigation, and sustainability. They're related, but all slightly different.
Absolutely. One of the things that I really wanted to highlight that she did say is the greatest pathway to adaptation is to reduce emissions, which is also a mitigation measure. But it's important to remember that that's the first tactic to try. But at the same time, we have to deal with the reality that we need to be resilient in the face of extreme weather events because they are happening.
Yeah. So we want to do what we can to stop the weather getting more extreme by using less energy, less carbon, but also acknowledge that it is going to get more extreme and therefore think about more extreme weather events, warmer climates, all those sorts of issues that our buildings that we're designing now are going to have to deal with going into the future. Ilka, what stood out for you?
So for me, I really appreciate how she kind of takes the step back and just looks at it, at everything through a broader lens, because I feel like, especially for me, sometimes I kind of get stuck in my certifications and these goals to meet those standards. And I think it's great the way she approaches it, where she sets up this broader framework and that is very adaptable to different locations and conditions and how people live and what they have to work with. And then maybe a certification can fit into these goals. But basically, at first, it's really just kind of looking at this broad lens and identifying the goals. And then this framework actually helps to make those goals happen. And also to bring all the right people to the table really early on and educate them very specifically according to the goals that were defined.
I really like that. And of course, we've seen it so many times in lots of different scenarios where there's a great benefit of bringing a team together early on from across the whole professional sector, but also some of the end users on bigger projects as well. And the more people you can get in a room and have a workshop to collect all the ideas, but also to help educate that team, there's just so many benefits to doing that. But it's kind of surprising how it doesn't happen very often, but it was great to hear her talk about that as a strategy for good design. It certainly got me thinking. I'm biased now that I'm back in the world of certifications at the working on our equivalent of LEED here in New Zealand, the Green Building Council. So my day job is working in certifications, but I acknowledge what Ilana talked about, and in the danger of getting locked into a prescribed model and some of the adverse effects that can induce. So we do need to be careful with all types of certification that it's not setting ourselves up for an adverse outcome if we're not stepping back and thinking about what we're actually trying to achieve. So I think that's a good lesson there and something to consider. Anything else from either of Mary or Ilka from that interview?
Well, following that thought, I like that she, when using her framework and considering the value of certification or developing a certification based on her framework, she was talking about how vulnerabilities are often localized. And it's a good point to think about. You're not looking just at the building, but you're looking at the neighborhood vulnerabilities. And so it's difficult to create a certification that could, award points for measures when these vulnerabilities might be different from one community to the next.
Yeah.
It's super interesting here where I live, because the county just recently released a report for a local community that's based right on the ocean. And it's all about being right on the ocean, and that they're starting a series of workshops to try and determine, well, how do we want to deal with sea level rise? And I think up until this point, people in that community wouldn't have even wanted to talk about it, because either they didn't acknowledge or they didn't want to acknowledge how vulnerable that all their homes are. And it's a small community.
Yeah.
But it's really, for me, I like that her framework looks at not just the building, but the neighborhood as well, because that's important.
Yeah.
And I would also like to add that I really like that her framework is not a pass or not pass, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like certification where you either do it or you don't, because I feel like sometimes if it's clear that you can't reach certification, you kind of give up, or maybe the owners now set their priorities someplace else instead of certification because they can't reach it anyway. So I think in her way of thinking, or looking at a broader picture or this framework where you're really prioritizing the best possible outcome for that project, it's not about passing or not. It's about what's the best you can do right here, right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So that framework, there's if you look that up, and we'll put some links to that, people can check it out. There's some good resources there. One other good resource that was alluded to at the end there, and I understand you've read some of Braiding Sweetgrass, Mary.
Yes. Yeah. It was.
And any other of Robin? Is it Robin Kimmerer?
Kimmer Wall, I think, was her name.
We can put a link to that as well. Zach and I talked about starting a bit of a book club. We've had some other requests from listeners about some good books out there. This one does look like a good one in terms of weaving together it's called Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. Sounds very, very topical to think about the technology that we use and the modeling software that we have, and the tools available are examples of that, but also keeping in mind what we can learn from the great wisdom of those that have gone before us, and also of just looking around at nature and what we can learn from the places where we happen to be right now, and that concept of borrowing from the planet.
So true. And Braiding Sweetgrass really has a kind of integrative framework aspect to it that Obama shares as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you both yet again for bringing us a wonderful guest and some thought-provoking ideas. It's always a pleasure to have you and the great people that you find come and join us on the show. Now, Zach normally does a bit of a rundown of events, but he's busy at one of those events at the time of this recording. As we said, he's over at FierceCon. So we'll look forward to hearing back from him next week. And if you do want to catch up and see what's going on, there are loads of great resources, and the Passive House Accelerator website is a great place to go to do that. And also, if you haven't already signed up for the newsletter, which is a regular, is it weekly? Mary comes out with
yes,
everything. I hardly ever get all the way through it because there's just so much content in there. So that's the best way to keep it up to date with what's going on. All right. Well, thank you, Mary and Ilka. Pleasure to have you back.